Up everybody, thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is August 12th, 2026, about 3 a.m. where I'm at right now. Now, I know the majority of my audience is in the US, so this is prime time for you to tune in. I know I'm usually coming to you around, let's say 7 or 8 p.m. my time, and that time is usually like around 2 or 3 p.m. generally in the US across the different time zones. So I know a lot of you probably are not at work now, not at school, not hanging out with your girl. So now you got some time to sit down, do some reading, and chat up in this open source library, open source book club as we dive into Book 3, Act 23, Episode 14, Marxism, Reparations, and the Black Freedom Struggle. We are on the last chapter of this phenomenal book that was compiled by our foundational Black American comrade and sister, Monica Moorhead, right here. Shout out to her. Maybe I'll try to reach out to her to get an interview at the end of this reading. We only have 2 more episodes to go, including this one. So I'm looking forward to finishing this book and letting the comments roll in eventually and hearing what you all think about the topic of reparations, the fight for socialism, internationalism, anti-imperialism, and all that good stuff. As you can also tell right now by my voice, it's late at night here, so I probably won't be doing all the yelling and turning up like I usually do on you fuck niggas when you turn up in this bitch. So yeah, we're gonna play it cool. Let me give a shout out to my guy Wasaru in the horizontal live stream. He said, yo man, when is it starting? Come on now. You know, I'm very flattered that somebody was waiting for me to come on live. I appreciate that you're waiting for me to come on live, because usually I turn on the lives, 0 people waiting, but people catch it on the playback, of course, because of the time difference, as you know. But shout out to Wasaru for, anticipating the live stream. That really humbles me. I'm very happy to say that somebody's out there waiting. Shout out to Paulo Silva up in the live stream. Shout out to Brazil. Tudo bem to all my Brazilians out there. Obrigado for tuning in right now. And like I said, we are diving into chapter 9, which is the final chapter of this book, Black Labor and Class Solidarity. We're going to be reading a few chapters here. This is the longest chapter in the book. It's over 40 pages, which is why we are breaking this chapter down into 2 episodes. So we will do the last episode of Book 3, Act 23 later today. I'm going to do this live stream, go to sleep, come back after I finish my classes and my other work for the day, and then do this live stream. Okay? So shout out to Imam Pakdel, who says, why doesn't America attack Iran? That's a stupid question. Because you ask a stupid question, you go to the stupid room. And the stupid room is where all the people that need to be re-educated go. So America is attacking Iran, killing innocent Iranian civilians, and you shall be over there learning about that, not over here. Get the fuck out of here. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into chapter 9, Black Labor and Class Solidarity. We have both live streams going, horizontal and vertical. If you got something you want to say to me or a comment about the text, in good faith, I will try to read it. Okay, so let's go here. Paulo says, I don't understand anything right here. He's talking in Portuguese. That's a shame. This is an English live stream. Try to turn on translations for the playbacks, but this is an English live stream primarily. But there are plenty of Brazilian comrades who do great work. In fact, actually, a few weeks ago, I was listening to a Brazilian comrade talking about the history of the Marxist-Leninist parties in Brazil. So there's a lot of like socialist content you can find about Brazil in Portuguese on YouTube. Catch you next time if you want to go look at that. Without further ado, let's go here. Chapter 9, Black Labor and Class Solidarity. In this picture here on the right, workers in a tobacco factory below, rebellion of kidnapped Africans about the Amistad. Okay, yeah, so go check out the movie Amistad if you haven't. Me and Acti reviewed it a few years ago, actually. All right, so Black Labor, from chattel slavery to wage slavery. This was written by Sam Marcy from High Tech Low Pay, published in 1986. Okay, this is the oldest article that we've read so far in this book. The scientific technological revolution has affected and will continue to affect black workers much more significantly than is commonly acknowledged by the capitalist press. Automation takes even more than its usual toll when oppressed people are concerned. It intensifies racist oppression and increases unemployment among black people, even when a capitalist economic recovery is said to be sharply on the rise, as in 1983 through 1984. But the impact of the scientific technological revolution on black people is not only a recent phenomenon, it has historical roots that go back to the beginning of the slave trade. The compass and the slave trade. The speed and momentum with which the scientific technological revolution has taken off in recent years has tended to shrink into insignificant inventions, which exercised a profound influence on developing social relations in the early stages of the capitalist system. Take the compass, which is regarded today as a basic direction-finding device in navigation. It is not a capitalist invention. It is said to have been discovered as early as the year 1100 in China, and may have also been discovered independently in Europe somewhat later. It was used by Arab sailors in the early 13th century. Its development and perfection over the years became indispensable to world trade. While not invented in a period of capitalist development, the compass and other navigational instrumentation were appropriated from earlier modes of production by capitalist shipping companies at the very crest of the period of colonization, what is called the Age of Discovery. It gave a tremendous impulse to world trade and commerce. But what was the content of this trade? Why is it important in relation to our study here? Because as trade became a world phenomenon, it was essentially an international trade of slaves. Millions upon millions of black people were kidnapped, tortured, and brought on slave ships to the vast new continents of the Western Hemisphere. The slave trade began in the mid-15th century when Spain and Portugal began importing a significant number of black slaves to their plantations on the Canary and Madeira Islands. Most of the very same leading imperialist powers that are today concerned with maintaining the South African regime in the face of the revolutionary mass movement there earlier participated in, promoted, and in fact fought ferociously to maintain the slave trade and obtain a monopoly over it. Modern transnational monopolies differ fundamentally in their economic content from those days, but they still show the same greed and avarice, the utterly unprecedented cruelty and barbarous treatment which characterized the slave trade. This is what lay behind the flourishing of world commerce and laid the development for what Marx later called the primitive accumulation of capital. The word primitive was not a characterization of the many millions of people captured as slaves. The term primitive was applied to the fiendish method by which the early capitalists accumulated the primary original capital that was so indispensable for the development of their system of oppression and exploitation. Not only Spain, Portugal, England, France, and Holland, but also Denmark, Sweden, and Prussia participated, garnering fabulous profits as a result of the slave trade. The compass was one of the things that made the slave trade possible, but it alone can't be held responsible for the transportation of this vast number of human beings from one continent to another, thousands of miles away from their homeland and loved ones to a strange new country where the whip and the gun held them at bay. Scandinavian people had made a transoceanic voyage earlier in the 12th century. They too may have had a compass of a sort, for it is well known that the Vikings undertook long voyages and established settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even Labrador. But these voyages differed fundamentally in that they were oriented towards settlements in the northern part of the world in harmony with the climatic conditions of the Scandinavian countries. until the development and perfection of navigational instrumentation, such as the compass. The Western world was mainly confined to the Mediterranean and the coastal areas of the Atlantic, so far as maritime commerce was concerned. The new era of discovery and colonization opened up the Atlantic for the first time. This could not have been done without the necessary technological improvements in navigational instrumentation as well as the making of ships. By 1745, the English inventor Gowen Knight had perfected a method of efficiently magnetizing needles of harder steel. He designed a compass with a single bar needle large enough for a cap resting on the pivot to be screwed into its center. He thus greatly improved the compass. This significantly shortened the time of voyages, increased the safety of the ships, and, what is of greater social and political significance, increased the volume of slavery. As Marx was to write, it is slavery that gave the colonies their value. It is the colonies that have created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greater importance. Let's read that again. That's from Marx right there, from Marx's own pen. Marx said, "It is slavery that gave the colonies their value. It is the colonies that have created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greatest importance." Very, very important. We need to remember that this world that we live in now is globalized. We have all been brought together because of capitalism. The shirt I'm wearing now was probably made in Bangladesh. The rings on my fingers were probably made in India. The tie I'm wearing now definitely came from Turkey because that's where I got it. And now you're listening to me right now, wherever you are in the world, in India, in Canada, in America, who knows where you are right now. And we have been all brought together because of capitalism. Yet inherently, because of capitalism, millions upon millions of bodies had to be buried in the sea. Millions and millions of people to this day work in de facto slavery. Because of capitalism, millions and millions of people have to work 20 plus hours in a day just to keep a roof over our heads. And so while capitalism has opened up vast amounts of wealth and vast amounts of opportunity and new technological advancements, it is up to us, the working class, to seize these great advancements for our own gain, because we create the wealth of this capitalist system. Let's continue here. The contract for supplying slaves to the Spanish colonies was called the Asentio. While British slave traders provided the necessary laborers for their own plantations, Spain contracted with the slave traders of other nations to supply its needs. The first Asentio was granted in 1518 to a Flemish company, and it specified that a certain number of tons, they were measuring slaves by the tons, be delivered to the Spanish colonies. The Portuguese were the first traders to hold the Asentio, but the other rising capitalist powers were not to be outdone. The Dutch broke into this very lucrative form of trade around 1640, and Spain, France, and Britain followed soon after. The war for the Asentio continued until the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, when the English triumphed over their competitors. The English bourgeoisie from then on maintained control of the slave trade through the Royal African Company. This slave trade covered not only the English, French, and Dutch colonies in America and the West Indies, but also the vast land of Brazil. It was in this way that such a vast portion of the African people were uprooted and thrown into the vortex of capitalist slavery. In connection with Holland, it should be noted that earlier in the years 1636 through 1637, the Dutch had engaged in a flourishing trade and development of tulips, for which they are still world famous today. But that trade attained extraordinary speculative proportions, so that at one period, just one tulip was valued at thousands of dollars. Eventually, the market broke, and the Dutch bourgeoisie turned from trafficking in a thing of matchless beauty to the slave trade. one of the most odious, foul, and certainly the most inhuman forms of commerce ever seen in history. This illustrates with what ease and facility the capitalists can plunge from one area to another in their insatiable appetite for profits without any regard for human values whatever. The latter are totally irrelevant in the process of capitalist productions. Capital simply flows to wherever profits are highest. This makes me think about EDP 445. Earlier on my channel today, I posted in the community tab that the EDP 445 documentary is the funniest thing I've seen this week. It's hilarious, and I encourage all of you to check it out. I'm not defending EDP 445 at all. For me, he could jump off a bridge now, die and go to hell, be resurrected and killed again. Fuck EDP 445. But what I found disgusting in the EDP 445 was not only his behavior, but also the fact he said that he had to work 2 jobs just to maintain his little 1-bedroom studio apartment, whatever he had in Las Vegas or wherever he lives. How do we not find that part odious? I know a lot of us nowadays just find that to be the norm. You gotta work 2 jobs, you gotta work 3 jobs, you gotta have a side hustle, you gotta do content on TikTok. How do we not find it disgusting today that the capitalist mode of production has degraded work so much that 1 job is not enough? And now we think, well, I just gotta hustle harder because one day maybe I'll be a billionaire and I'll never have to work again. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I find the way that we have to work now as no different than slavery. It's no different than slavery. All of us essentially are slaves today. If you gotta work 2 jobs, if you can't keep up with the bills, if you can't maintain groceries in your fridge without having a side hustle on the side, then we're living in de facto slavery. So everything I read here about how the capitalist mode of production created this insatiable urge for profits for these colonial powers and these companies that were created to traffic in human flesh, it's no different today. It's no different today than having to do Uber Eats on the side, having to do your main job and all of that. It's absolutely insane. All right. So let's continue here. The banks and the drug trade. The world slave trade has been superseded by the world drug trade. It has been widely reported that today, marijuana, whose cultivation is illegal, has become the single most valuable cash crop in U.S. agriculture. Pause right here. Let me go to my guy Kamal up in the live stream. He says, we work too much as it is. Facts. Shout out to my guy Kamal right here. 20th Century says, are you a foundational Black American? Yes, I am. Yes, I am. And I'm also a Marxist and a pro-reparationist. So hopefully you stick around to learn more about socialism, the fight for reparations, and how we are going to overthrow the wicked imperialist U.S. state. Hopefully you stick around for that 20th century. And shout out to my guy Kamal for joining the live stream as well. Let's continue here. So the world slave trade has been superseded by the world drug trade. It has been widely reported that today marijuana, whose cultivation is illegal, has become the single most valuable cash crop in U.S. agriculture. This should not surprise anyone in light of the fact that some of the biggest banks have been fined millions of dollars for laundering money, that is, disguising deposits from the criminal underworld engaged in the sale of not only marijuana, but heroin and cocaine. The age of telecommunications has made it possible for the banks and the criminal underworld to work as partners. I made a video on my channel about, 4 years ago at this point, talking about why I don't smoke marijuana. And I don't smoke marijuana not because I'm not a fan of the ganja. Though generally I'm not. I'm going to keep it real. Every time I smoke ganja, I always get sad, which is why it's not my cup of tea. But I don't procure marijuana because when you buy marijuana, you are supporting, mostly by and large, the illicit drug trade, which is also a form of slavery that happens today. These cartels, these drug traffickers basically use very poor people as mules, as workers in this exploitative system. The marijuana that's grown in Mexico or Guatemala or any other country comes from the hands of farm laborers who are getting the same amount of money from growing marijuana that they would for growing tomatoes or potatoes or cucumbers or avocados. And they are basically slaves under these cartels where, once again, the money siphons up towards the top. So I'm not a fan of the boycott strategy of fighting against capitalist exploitation because, number one, it's neoliberal, it's individualized. We can never overturn this system just by saying we're not going to buy into it. We're going to overturn this system by not working in it, going on mass strikes. That's the way to do it. But it's just for me and my personal preference. I feel like every time I smoke a joint that I got illicitly, I am somehow supporting the Sinaloa or somehow supporting the Zetas and all of those exploitative cartels that also traffic in human flesh. All right. So yeah, shout out to my guy Kamal who says pro reparations. Hopefully, if you're on this channel, we are all pro reparations. Absolutely. And shout out to Big Poppy. He says, what do we replace this state with? We replace the bourgeois states with the workers' states. We replace a state of the Epstein class of pedophiles who like to fuck and eat children and also make us work 20-hour days and make everything the gig economy and automate our jobs. We replace the bourgeois state with the workers' state. That's what we are looking to do, Big Poppy. That's a great question right there. Continuing here. So the underworld, even if not part of the establishment, can't help but integrate themselves with the banks. They want the interest on their money. Drug bust used to yield amounts in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. This then escalated into the millions. Recently, some drug busts have netted loot worth more than $1 billion. It has escalated because it is so lucrative, like the slave trade. And what is the interest of $1 billion? At just 6%, it comes to $60 million. The banks have to get involved in the drug trade because it is a lucrative source of deposits, which are then loaned out at a profit. The summits of high finance are involved. Among the banks caught red-handed have been Bank of America, the biggest in the country, and the First Boston Corporation. Bank of America was fined $4.75 million, and First Boston $500,000. Chase Manhattan Manufacturers, Hanover Trust, Chemical, Crocker National, and Irving Trust have had to pay civil penalties ranging from $210,000 to $360,000 for reported violations. What are they hiding? The deposits of profits from the criminal underworld engaged in destructive drug trafficking, which takes an especially great toll in the oppressed communities. Legality and illegality coexist under the capitalist system and always have. Even after the slave trade was outlawed, it continued despite harsh penalties, and so does the drug trade. Very interesting. You know, $210,000 is like pennies to a bank, especially one like, Chase or Bank of America. It's almost laughable how they find these banks, even if it's in the millions of dollars, because these banks, factor in how much crime can we commit every year and just write it off. They, like the same way Walmart factors in how much shoplifting will happen this year. Okay, about, $20 million worth of our merchandise will be shoplifted. So we price that into our other products. The price of the products you get at Walmart aren't supposed to be, let's say right now, a t-shirt at Walmart is $10. I'm pretty sure about $2 of that is factored in towards the amount that's shoplifted every single year. And the same thing with the banks as well. They factor in how much penalties are we going to have to pay for breaking the law and fucking over the American people or the global South or whoever we're going to fuck over. You get what I'm saying? So yeah, let's continue here. At a time when the banks are so heavily involved in unrecoverable loans worth hundreds of billions of dollars in connection with the indebtedness of oppressed countries, how many would not resort to this most modern and technologically advanced artifice to support their credit positions? The observations made over a century ago by a certain T.J. Dunning and quoted by Marx and Capital ring all too familiar today. With adequate profit, capital is very bold. A certain 10% will ensure its employment anywhere. 20% certain will produce eagerness, 50% positive audacity, 100% will make it ready to trample all human laws, 300%, and there is not a crime at which it will not scruple, nor a risk it will not run, even to the chance of its owner being hanged. If turbulence and strife will bring a profit, it will freely encourage both. Smuggling and the slave trade have amply proved all that is here stated. Very powerful. You know, one of my criticisms of Marx has been, and also Lenin as well, has been not them highlighting revolutions like the Haitian Revolution as well. But hearing Marx talk so openly and quote other writers of his time speaking openly about how the slave trade is one of the worst examples of capitalism, or capitalism at its most base and most depraved, and also at its very root and foundational to its existence, the desire for profits by any means necessary. Fuck it, they ban slavery. Well, we'll find another way to do slavery. We start sweatshops in Indonesia or something like that. Yeah, I'm actually very happy to be reading this because I have not encountered these quotes. Capital is next up in the Books React series, so I'm looking forward to reading that with all of you and engaging that text as well. Shout out to my guy Kamal in the chat. He says, Bank of America, no wonder why I got away from them. Yeah, I mean, all the banks, you know, we're pretty much trapped to work with all of the banks, Kamal. It's the worst part about our system. I wish there was a way that we could debank and keep our money in a way that it doesn't help perpetuate the system, but it's sort of like we're trapped in this right now. Though if you know of a way we could debank, and I'm not talking about crypto because crypto is just a part of this capitalist pyramid scheme as well. But if you know of another way to debank, let me know because I'd be very interested in doing that. So let's go here. Kamal says, ironically, I watched an episode of Matlock today about the U.S. Latin American smuggling. It's very interesting that the author here didn't mention that not only are the banks profiting from drug trafficking, but it's the U.S. government as well. It's been widely documented that Reagan was trafficking drugs from Latin America to help pay for his war in Iraq and Iran, and the Iran-Contra thing is just widely understood. I mean, CIA stands for Cocaine Intercepting Agency. The Cocaine Intake Agency. Yeah, the Cocaine Intake Administration is what CIA stands for, basically. So let's continue here. So, the invention of the cotton gin. While the compass as a technological device in the field of navigation was appropriated by the developing bourgeoisie from an earlier mode of production dating back many hundreds of years, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 belongs strictly to the era of capitalist development. Its invention was called forth by the development of capitalist trade and commerce. Its influence on slavery was stupendous. A great deal has been written about Eli Whitney as the inventor of the cotton gin and as a great scientist, which he certainly was. However, according to some accounts, the first gin made in Mississippi was constructed on the basis of a crude drawing by a skilled slave. I'm not surprised that Eli Whitney probably stole the idea of the cotton gin from a black man who actually was out there working every day in the actual fields and in this mode of production. That makes sense. This tracks with European history. Shout out to OG Kicks joining the live stream. He said he got 100 flows, he got 100 hoes and 100 whips. Yeah, 100 chicks waiting in the back to get their booty smacked. Yeah, shout out to my guy OG Kicks up in the live stream, for real. Anyway, so yeah, Eli Whitney stole the idea from of the cotton gin from a skilled slave. This was probably not very unusual in light of the fact that even among the first slaves brought to this country from Africa, many were skilled craftsmen. Also, in both the South and the North, there were skilled free blacks. Since the slaves were never recognized in law as persons, the slave owners could appropriate their property as well as any invention they might conceive of. And this is still very relevant today. As we know, the legacy of slavery bleeds through all other aspects of American business and culture and society. And As a person who studied the music industry, my first degree was in music industry studies at Loyola University. Now I'm in Budapest, Hungary, studying sociology. But when I was studying music industry studies, one of the most interesting clauses in certain music industry contracts is the work for hire. Essentially, an artist can write a song. I don't know, Madonna writes Like a Virgin, all from her heart in her bedroom. But because she's signed to Atlantic or Virgin or whatever, her contract might say it's a work for hire, meaning the song technically belongs to the record label. Madonna can't write her name on it and say she's the songwriter because it doesn't matter. The work belongs to the company, which is insane to think about because art is one of the few things that humans can do right now to generate profit, where alienation is not as much a part of the production process. In almost all of our other jobs, whether we work in service or manufacturing, whatever we do, there's a level of alienation. That's why you go to McDonald's and the person who's taking your order doesn't give a fuck about what you ordered. It might have an attitude with you. Hell, might even throw hands with you if you say the wrong thing because they don't care about their job. There's no material benefit they really get from flipping burgers all day, right? This would be different in a system of production where alienation is not a part of the process, where we actually see a material benefit from what we actually make and do every single day. But I digress. Let's continue here. So the cotton gin has often been described as the very soul of simplicity. However, it should be borne in mind that cotton has been spun, woven, and dyed from the earliest times. Cotton formed the staple clothing of India, Egypt, and China. Hundreds of years before the Christian era, cotton textiles were woven in India with matchless skill, and their use spread to the Mediterranean countries. In the 1st century, traders brought fine muslin and calico to Italy and Spain. The Arabs introduced the cultivation of cotton into Spain in the 9th century. By the 17th century, the East India Company was bringing rare fabrics from India. Before the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas, cotton was skillfully spun there and woven into fine garments and dyed tapestries. Fabrics were found in Peruvian tombs that even belonged to pre-Inca cultures. Cotton was first planted by the Europeans in Virginia's Jamestown colony in 1607. Damn, the Europeans were behind. Look at that. You know, the Europeans like to say, you were living in mud huts. You were living in mud huts, as if a mud hut was not only useful in the, sub-Saharan African climate, but also as if Europeans didn't also build mud huts as well. But I digress. How late can you be when cotton had been used for thousands of years? Black Jesus was wearing cotton in the hot-ass Middle East while the Europeans were like scratching their butt wearing wool in the middle of summer. Just ass. Just European booty scratches, just coming late to the game. You got to take these shots, boy. You got to take these shots. Anyway, the so-called cotton belt in the U.S., where cotton has historically been the main cash crop, now marijuana is, extends through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, West Tennessee, East Arkansas, Louisiana, East Texas, and South Oklahoma, and also in smaller areas of Southeast Missouri, Southwest Kentucky, North Florida, and Southeast Virginia. But prior to the invention of the cotton gin, cotton production was at a very low level. It was almost insignificant in the prevailing Southeast economy. The plantation system rested mainly on tobacco and to a lesser extent on rice and indigo. Rarely has an important technological development taken place which was as simple as the cotton gin. It separated the seeds from the cotton through a process using a cylinder with bent spikes sharpened to form hooks. They were set in a ring and revolved through slots in a bar. The teeth pulled away the lint, which was then cleaned from the teeth by brushes. A hand crank operated the whole machine. What did this machine accomplish? As Eli Whitney himself explained in a letter, the machine makes the labor 50 times less without throwing any class of people out of business. Of course, the slave economy was not characterized by unemployment, unlike wage slavery. The cotton gin tremendously increased the productivity of black slave labor on the plantations. The figures in cotton crop production speak for themselves. In 1790, before the use of the cotton gin, the cotton crop of the U.S. amounted to 1.5 million pounds. By 1800, it had risen to 35 million pounds. By 1810, it had soared to 85 million pounds. And by 1860, it reached the astounding sums of 2 billion pounds. My God. The introduction of the cotton gin thus brought about a profound social revolution. A machine that could increase the productivity of labor 50 times was nothing less than sensational. It thoroughly revolutionized Southern agriculture as well as Northern production methods. Furthermore, it was in response to the tremendous social transformation evoked by the Industrial Revolution in England, which had brought about a skyrocketing demand for cotton and a sharp price increase. As Marx explained it in broader terms, a radical change in the mode of production in one sphere of industry involves a similar change in other spheres. This happens at first in such branches of industry as are connected together by separate phases of a process, and yet are isolated by the social division of labor in such a way that each of them produces an independent commodity. Thus, spinning by machinery made weaving by machinery a necessity, and both together made the mechanical and chemical revolution that took place in bleaching, printing, and dyeing imperative. So too, on the other hand, the revolution in cotton spinning called forth the invention of the gin. For separating the seeds from the cotton fiber, it was only by means of this invention that the production of cotton became possible on the enormous scale at present required. Very perceptive of Marx to point out, essentially this machine brought about a change in production, which then causes other changes in the economy to happen, thus causing a further division of labor, but also a division in the social classes as well. It has a social impact aside from its economic impact. In fact, the social impact is derived from the economic impact or change that's caused by this mode of production. Let's continue here. But how did it affect slavery itself? This peculiar institution, as it was called at the time. Did the sensational, spectacular development in technology retard slavery or expand it? From the time school children attend their earliest classes, they are taught about the wonders of modern science and what a liberating influence it has. Did the cotton gin at the time help to weaken slavery as the general conceptions cultivated and promoted by the bourgeoisie maintain? As we shall see, it strengthened slavery. And this happened at a time when it appeared, although it was only appearances, that slavery was in a decline. I remember reading about Eli Whitney and the cotton gin in high school when they were teaching about slavery in history class. They did sort of frame it. Granted, I'm a product of Louisiana public schools. They did try to frame it like, it's kind of sad. If Eli Whitney didn't invent the cotton gin, slavery would have been out of here. But he invented the cotton gin, and then boom, it became even more profitable. But we were always going to get rid of slavery. I hate that whenever they teach American history, they always try to frame it like, yeah, we were just about to do it. We were just about to free the slaves. No, you weren't. No, you weren't. Unless there was that massive slave revolt, which we call the Civil War, they were not just going to let us free. There was gonna be no gradual emancipation or manumission. It's a lie. It's always been a lie. And it's part of that lost cause narrative as well. But let's continue here. It is necessary to look at the currents of thought which gave political expression to this phenomenon. For instance, the Continental Congress of 1774 proposed that the practice of importing slaves be stopped. Rhode Island and Connecticut passed laws providing that all chattel slaves brought within their respective provinces be freed, and Delaware prohibited the importation of bondsmen in 1776. Later, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, and Maryland all forbade the importation of slaves. The slave trade itself, of course, was finally prohibited in the U.S. more than a decade after the introduction of the cotton gin in 1808. But it should not be forgotten that the Constitutional Convention of 1788 wrote a clause into the Constitution making it impossible as a matter of federal law to abolish the slave trade on a national basis before 1808. The demise of the slave trade has to be viewed in the light of class interest, first of the slaveocracy itself. Why would they, as slave owners, be interested in abolishing it? Why, for instance, would George Mason of Virginia, himself a slave owner and supporter of slavery, condemn the slave trade as diabolical itself and disgraceful to mankind? Only by piercing the veil of capitalist hypocrisy, only by going behind the political rhetoric and seeking out the materialist interest of any given class, only by applying the materialist interpretation of history and analyzing social and political phenomena in terms of class interests can we understand the politics, the social and political values. Thus, the basic reasons behind abolishing the importation of slaves, even in the above-named southern states, and castigating the trade as a disgrace to mankind, was the fact that there had been a huge influx of slaves. Like the excessive influx of any commodity governed by the law of supply and demand, this cheapened the price of a slave. The reason behind it were economic in origin, masked in moralistic phraseology. It's a very interesting take right here. So essentially what he's saying is that, Maryland or Vermont or New York banning slavery was not done out of moralistic purposes. White people, out of the goodness of their heart, didn't just say, we have to ban slavery. We just have to do it. It's the Christian thing to do. No. It was because of the motor production. The North was very industrialized. They had a workforce that needed to be employed. And you, once again, cannot compete with slave labor. No matter how little you're getting paid, if somebody's getting it for free, they're always going to choose free. And also, he's making the very argument that because so many slaves were imported and then also bred, I'm surprised the author didn't mention that slave breeding was a major part of maintaining this slaveocracy. Because there were so many slaves in the states, it cheapened the price of a slave, thus even cheapening labor even more. You have so many of these people that are forced to work for free, therefore labor becomes ever more cheap, and this cannot coexist in a bourgeois capitalist mode of production. All right, let's continue here. A surplus of slaves in some of the southern states motivated the agitation against further importation. Most of this agitation, it should be noted, was before the use of the cotton gin really took off on a mass scale, producing unprecedented profits. But there was also opposition to the slave trade motivated by an entirely different set of circumstances. This was a thoroughgoing revolutionary development which is highly obscured in U.S. history, particularly as it relates to the early struggles of the black people before the Civil War. This revolutionary development fired the imagination of the enslaved black people in this country and frightened the ruling class, both North and South. The insurrections given the most detailed accounts in modern literature were those of Gabriel in Virginia in 1800, Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina, 1822, and most famous, that of Nat Turner in Southampton County, Virginia, 1831. I've heard of Denmark Vesey. Of course, we've all heard of Nat Turner. I never heard of Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia. Has anybody heard of Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia? That sounds like something that we should research as well. I'd be very interested to look deeper into Gabriel's Rebellion. And shout out to Denmark Vesey, and fuck all snitches. All snitches need to die. I wish Denmark Vesey didn't get snitched on so that he could kill all of those slave owners. It would have been so glorious for their blood to run through the plantations, run through the streets in Charleston. It would have been so glorious. Oh my God. Even if Denmark Vesey eventually would have got captured, it would have been such a beautiful sight, such a wonderful thing for those slave owners to be killed and slaughtered, all of them. Continuing here. However, a great many insurrections took place which are only beginning to be taken note of. The Civil War itself demonstrated many instances of insurrections by the black people. The black masses under slavery were not the passive, docile force imagined by bourgeois historiography, especially in the literature predating the mass movement of black people in this century. Here's a picture here of Nat Turner organizing the rebellion. If you haven't seen If you haven't seen Birth of a Nation, not the 1910 racist one, but the one about Nat Turner, go check it out. And also check out Birth of a Nation, which is like an NWA documentary. I believe it has Ice Cube, Eazy-E, Dr. Dre, all in them, like in the later years of NWA. I find it interesting that we've always been trying to reclaim the idea of Birth of a Nation, because I think it speaks to something very important, that media became a weaponization of white supremacist ideology. And we as black folks, because a lot of us are powerless in terms of capital, understand that media can be a leveling force in fighting against white supremacy. So while the white supremacists try to do whatever they can to propagate their nonsense, such as sending bots into a radical live stream like mine, where there are white supremacists flooding in, leaving hateful or stupid, ridiculous content and comments, or they try to take over social media sites like Twitter and X, we as black folks, or as radical folks in general, realize that the fight for media and the fight for the control over the media and the narrative derived from media can be very important in the combat and in the battle against white supremacy and capitalist exploitation. I was thinking about that last night when I found that NWA documentary, A Birth of a Nation, right? But I digress. Let's continue here. So black rebellions go back in history to the very beginning of slavery in this country, as early as 1687, 1 year previous to the glorious revolution in the mother country by England. The revolution in England that consolidated the power of the bourgeoisie as against the old feudal aristocracy. There was widespread revolt throughout the colonies, and at a time when the Negro population of the Old Dominion was about equal to that of whites. That was the attempted insurrection in Northern Neck. All were executed when the plot was discovered and the revolt was crushed. All snitches should die. All snitches should die. I wish I could go back in time. I spoke about this in a previous live stream. I want to go back in time to give, George Washington a 1-2. Thomas Jefferson a kick in the nuts and stomp him while he's down. But I wish I could go back in time and also, do a karate chop to the neck to all those slaves who snitched on the slave rebellions or the slave rebellion planners and plotters. How dare you, nigga? I would go back in time and give those raccoons the business, for real. How dare you? How dare you, boy? Insane, insane. Anyway, continuing here. How interesting, in light of present-day developments in South Africa, that the Virginia Council passed a ban on public funerals for the dead slaves in fear that they would bring out mass demonstrations and might even provoke another rebellion. One thing to remember in connection with the early slave insurrections is that they were influenced politically by the English Revolution and, much more profoundly, by the French Revolution. The Great Revolution of this century, especially in Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, and Angola, and now the emerging revolutionary struggle in South Africa, have also had the most profound effect among the exploited and oppressed masses everywhere. The spectacular success of the cotton gin in raising the productivity of labor of these slaves tremendously strengthened the South, strengthened slavery, and impelled the slaveholders to become not only more aggressive and bellicose, but far more important, more expansionist. Slavery drove into the Southwest and everywhere it could in order to expand its plantations and garner in unprecedented profits. Cotton production was extensive in character, appropriating more and more land, rather than intensively applying mechanical devices. It drove the slaves harder and harder, often beyond endurance. But the very invention which had become such a tremendous advantage to the Southern planters, like all social phenomenon, soon began to develop one of the sharpest social contradictions which ultimately would undo the slaveocracy altogether. Once again, inside every mode of production, there are the seeds of its own destruction. And this isn't me being original. This is, foundational Marxist thought. So within slaveocracy, what is the destruction? What is the seed of destruction? It's the actual people that you are keeping in bondage. Always keep in mind, or never forget, man's will to be free. Moses split the fucking Red Sea for his people to be free. And I believe that. I believe that to be true as a Muslim. I believe the stories of the miracles of the prophets to be true. So if Moses split the Red Sea to be free, what do you think 1 million people held in bondage, told that they're less than human, brought down to the level of beast, what they will do to reclaim their humanity? They will move the moon and the stars to be free. And that's what our people did. And that's why we should always be proud. And all working class people should be proud of the Haitian Revolution, Nat Turner's revolution, John Brown's fight for freedom. We should be proud of all of the slave revolts, regardless of our race, gender, national origin, because it is inspirational to see what people who have nothing, who have been brought down to nothing, will do to be free and the successes they have. It's always inspirational. I'm not Italian, but I find inspiration in Spartacus. And I hope an Italian would find inspiration in Toussaint Louverture. You get what I'm saying? But I digress. Let's continue here. Slavery versus capitalist production. The South was a slaveocracy based on an ancient mode of production within the geographical confines of a new world social order, the bourgeois social order, with its own mode of capitalist production. One of the fundamental differences between the bourgeoisie mode of production and older modes of production, so eloquently brought out in the Communist Manifesto, is that the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instrument of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. How does this stack up with the Southern slaveocracy? Marx continued, conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. The South tried to retain the old slaveocracy, not only in unaltered form, but in extreme rigidity. It was therefore on a collision course with the new bourgeois state, or new bourgeois order, with the process of capitalist production and its tremendous growth in the North. Another and more flagrant contradiction was that one of the fundamental characteristics of the capitalist mode of production is wage slavery, which means a free proletariat, that is, a worker free to sell his or her labor on the capitalist market. Capitalist production and the extraction of surplus value in the interest of further capitalist accumulation is virtually impossible without a free working class, free to be exploited and oppressed, free to be unemployed. Chattel slavery was thus thoroughly incompatible with wage slavery. So Marxism 101, for anybody out there who's listening silently and waiting for teacher Simon, master Simon to give you the knowledge, essentially what Marx is saying is that all modes of production face an inevitable hurdle. There's revolution around the corner. And the bourgeois revolution was the industrial revolution. The idea that there was going to be a capitalist class that would have power that would overwhelm the old modes of production, which was feudalism. The idea that a lord would rule over the land and have serfs and peasants that work for him. But that holds in the labor. And what the bourgeois want are people who are free to be able to move from this job to that job, hell, maybe work 2 jobs. We need, in a bourgeois capitalist mode of production, you need people that are able to work freely, because this allows the system to always revolutionize, always maximize the modes of profit and the rate of profit as well. But this goes against the slave system because, once again, chattel slavery was thoroughly incompatible with wage slavery. People cannot freely move from one plantation to another. This is incompatible, and thus they were on a collision course. And that's why, it wasn't moralism. It wasn't some higher ideal. It wasn't Christian virtue that motivated some people to be against slavery. It was because they wanted to usher in a new economic system, which was capitalism, incompatible with a slaveocracy. Let's continue here. Slavery as an economic institution has everywhere proved itself uneconomical. This is especially true when it depends on one great crop, such as cotton, with diminishing reliance on sugar, rice, and other products. The South was turning into a monocultural economy. Overall, the spectacular leap in technology on which the Southern planters depended so heavily to maintain slavery was only one of many scientific and technological developments in an era which was rapidly turning them out in greater and greater numbers. In this respect, the South was falling far behind the North. I'd argue, as somebody from the South, from the modern South, the new South as they call it, the South is still far, far behind the North. It's far behind the world. If you've been to Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, Texas, you'll realize it's a third world failed hellhole. And that's because of the deliberate choices made by a capitalist class to keep people poor, ignorant, ununionized. They're passing these right-to-work laws where it sounds like you have the right to have a job when really it's the right for your boss to fire you at any time for any reason, at no fault at all. God, the South is a hellhole. I would not wish the South on my worst enemy. I would not wish the South on my worst enemy. And I got a lot of enemies. I got a lot of enemies. Oh, man. Anyway, continuing here. The North was making all the great strides in science and technology. It built up great universities, which became centers for basic research. Whatever prominence the South had in science in the earlier days, it was losing to the North. Seen in terms of the contemporary struggle in technology of the U.S. against Japan and Western Europe, the South was steadily losing ground to the North in what we would call today the technological race. As a competing form of economic and social system compared to the social system based on capitalist production, slavery was hopelessly out of place and had no chance, save by the use of sheer force. Slavery was static, fixed, and extremely rigid in its form of production. It was also characterized by the most outlandish forms of cruelty and brutality. The capitalist system, on the other hand, while certainly not characterized by either compassion or humanity, was nevertheless revolutionizing its means of production. That is, it was advancing science and technology. The change from chattel slavery to wage slavery was a profoundly revolutionary change, a tremendous social transformation. But historically, it constituted a change in the form of exploitation, not its abolition. You know, when I think back about, how the Civil War actually was fought, it's almost crazy that there are people that think the South actually could have won. The South had no chance. The South had no chance of winning. That's why I stopped watching all these alternative history, videos about what if the South won? What if slavery still existed today? There was no chance for the South to win. Absolutely none, because you're up against a, mechanized, revolutionizing force that's ever changing and ever adaptive to circumstances, and also against the negation within your own self. You're trying to keep a mass of people, millions of armed or potentially armed men from their own freedom. There was never a chance that the South was going to win the Civil War at any point. And even if they had won the war against the Union, there was, right around the corner, millions of black men who had now had military training that were going to eventually overthrow the slaveocracy. Because within the slaveocracy, there is the contradiction of holding millions of people in bondage when it is inherently within man. I know the white supremacists don't think black people are actually people, but we are actual humans, which goes against some Afro-pessimists out there who say that we are not humans, but I digress. We are actually men, we are actually human, and we have a desire for freedom, which is the core of all human desire, I would say. So yeah, it was eventually going to fall. The slaveocracy, whether it was brought down by the Union or by an armed uprising of black people, it was eventually going to fall. The same way that we know capitalism will eventually fall, because within it, it carries the seeds of its own destruction. I digress. So, thus we see that while the first phase of the scientific technological revolution brought fabulous profits to the South and gave it the power to expand, it ultimately undid slavery. Just as technological change undermined the Southern slaveocracy, so will it make obsolete the present industrial financial plutocracy with its system of wage slavery. He said it best. Shout out to George Washington Carver right here, knitting in the last years. Shout out to George Washington Carver, the man we all think invented peanut butter, but he didn't. He didn't. He didn't invent peanut butter. He invented 100 things you could use with a peanut. Peanut Viagra. But you can't call George Washington Carver the father of peanut butter. I forgot who it was. Anyway, black scientists and inventors. It is beyond the province of this study to give any accounting of the many scientific inventions made, particularly during the last half of this century. The modern epoch in which the bourgeois system of production has predominated has been abundant in scientists and inventors whose contributions have laid the material foundation for present-day society. However, there has been a systematic attempt in the U.S. to omit the very significant contributions of black scientists. Popular science books available to the public contain the names of only a small number of black inventors and scientists. There are 14 black scientists who are acknowledged to have made outstanding contributions to science. Yet, the Encyclopedia Britannica, the 1980 edition, lists only 4. Conspicuously absent is Norbert Rillot, born 1806, died 1894. He is one of 3 black scientists who actually revolutionized an industry. In Rillot's case, it was sugar refining. By inventing the vacuum pan evaporation, he transformed the sugar industry of the world. That his name could be forgotten in a country which produces and consumes more refined sugar per capita than any other is hard to conceive of, except on the basis of flagrant racist prejudice. I'm gonna keep it real. I never heard of Rillot before today. Until 1846, sugarcane juice was transformed into sugar by a very primitive, costly, and slow process. Rillot's invention replaced the manual operation with a mechanical one. As Lewis Haber tells us in his Black Pioneers of Science and Invention, slaves had formerly transferred the sugarcane juice from one boiling kettle to another by means of long ladles. With Rillot's device, a single worker could operate the completely enclosed machine through outside valves. It was Rillot and George Washington Carver, born 1860 and died 1943, who rescued the South from being transformed into a hopelessly backward agricultural adjunct to the North, similar to the role played by the southern parts of Italy until very recently. All those statues of Confederate generals need to be torn down, and statues of guys like Rillot, George Washington Carver, and also the many white inventors, innovators, scientists that came from what we call the American South should replace them. I don't know why this would be controversial. There's heritage in saying that we're proud of this inventor from Tennessee. We're proud of this poet from Georgia. We're proud of this novelist from Louisiana. There is nothing to be proud of a man who fought against your own country for his right to own people as property. So yeah, and just for the fact that it celebrates making money, once again, if you never read David Montero's book, The Stolen Wealth of Slavery, I will just tell you right now, most of the major plantation owners were broke boys. They were broke boys, constantly in debt, spending their money on fancy clothes and parties and extravagant trips to Europe. And they were broke boys living from loan to loan to loan. You know what I mean? So it's very important that we celebrate ballers, shot callers, not niggas who couldn't keep pennies in their pocket because they kept on, doing excursions to Paris for their syphilis treatment, which were the majority of the slaveholders. Broke boys. Anyway, I continue here. Carver, however, is much too well known throughout the world for his reputation to be obscured. It was Carver's work in soil improvement and the diversification of crops which made him famous. He discovered hundreds of uses for the peanut, the sweet potato, and the soybean, and thus stimulated the culture of these important crops. He also derived many products from cotton waste and extracted blue, purple, and red pigments from local clay. Many industries sprang up as a result of the use of peanut products. It helped to stimulate the Southern economy to the extent that many farmers found it more profitable to engage in the production of peanuts than tobacco. Carver also demonstrated that from the pecan, which grew well in the South, could be extracted 75 different products. When there was an overproduction of cotton, Carver showed how it could be used to make insulating board, paper, rugs, cordage, and even paving blocks for highways. Carver's achievements were perhaps best summarized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who said upon his death, "The world of science has lost one of its most eminent figures, and the races from which he sprang an outstanding member." And the race from which Carver sprang, they lost an outstanding member. The versatility of his genius and achievement in diverse branches of the arts and science were truly amazing. All mankind are the beneficiaries of his discoveries in the field of agricultural chemistry. The things which he achieved in the face of early handicap will for all time afford an inspiring example to use everywhere. Now, if you grew up like me, or even if you didn't, and you heard the stories about George Washington Carver, Benjamin Banneker, hell, even some of the civil rights leaders of the past like Frederick Douglass, they always make it seem like these exceptional Negroes proved the exception wrong, or proved the rule wrong, and therefore you should strive to be like them to achieve your ultimate humanity. I'm not trying to take any glory away from George Washington Carver or Benjamin Banneker, because they were exceptional people. But I think the way we're taught about them in America is like, you should try to be like Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, W.B. Du Bois, so that you can not be discriminated against, so you can not be like them. We have to be clear that we are humans, first and foremost, without having to do any of the extra shit. I shouldn't have to be like George Washington Carver. I shouldn't have to be perfect like a Barack Obama as far as his character just as a man, never mind his politics or his actions as president. I shouldn't have to be like Frederick Douglass to be treated with dignity and respect. But yet and still, this white supremacist framing that we're given when they teach us about our heroes, particularly when they teach us about our ancestors who are heroes who came before us, they put up these examples and say, be like them, rather than telling us that none of you should be treated as less than simply because. I hope that's absolutely clear. For example, there's probably some white person watching now like, that guy Simon, he's one of the good ones. See his nice crisp tie and his French cuffs? He's one of the good ones. I wish all of them were like him. But that's why you see me on my channel. I wear bandanas, I wear tank tops, I wear ties, I wear suits, I come on naked, I might come on shirtless. I got a few videos on this channel of me shirtless, just doing whatever. Because we will never be free by playing the respectability politics game, just to keep it absolutely short. And while we are inspired by the stories of, George Washington Carver and all of those great people who came before us, I don't want the framing of those stories to be like, that's the model Negro. Like there's no model of blackness. We should just be free to be ourselves in all our faults and our glory and receive dignity. You get what I'm saying? That's all I gotta say. So I just had to go on that rant because just hearing about George Washington Carver takes me back to like 6th grade. You know what I mean? So yeah, anyway. A third great black scientist who transformed and revolutionized an entire industry was Jan Matzlinger, born 1852 and died 1889. Although much less known than his two eminent fellow scientists, he invented what at the time seemed an impossible feat, a machine which would mass produce shoes. Matzlinger accomplished for the shoe industry what Eli Whitney's gin did for the cotton industry of the South. That's incredible. I never heard about that, brother. That's crazy. Jan Matzlinger. I got to look him up. See, this book is foundational. I'm so glad I'm reading this book. A lot of gems, a lot of history. Every page has just been enlightening. I love this book so far. All right. While it's true there were a number of machines in use in the shoemaking industry around the time of Matzlinger's invention, none seem to have been able to connect the upper to the sole of the shoe. It was believed such a thing could not be done. Matzlinger's machine did it. It could turn out a complete shoe. At first, the machine made a record run of 75 pairs of women's shoes in one day. Later, Matzlinger's machine made as many as 700 pairs of shoes a day. It also reduced the cost of shoes by half and was soon being applied on a worldwide scale. In industry, there were at least four more black scientists who made very significant contributions to the development of science and technology, but are little known. One was the man who invented the automatic lubrication of machinery, Elijah McCoy, born 1844 and died in 1929, whose work gave rise to the expression, the real McCoy. Before his time, a machine had to be stopped in order to be lubricated. Then there was Granville T. Woods, born 1856 and died in 1910, who developed so many electrical inventions that he was known as the Black Edison. There was also Lewis H. Latimer, born 1848 and died 1928, who advanced electric lighting, and Garrett A. Morgan, born 1877, died 1963, who invented the traffic light. In this century, a number of black scientists have made outstanding contributions in the field of health and medicine. Charles R. Drew perfected techniques to preserve blood plasma, which made possible the use of blood banks. Percy L. Julian developed synthetic cortisone, which, among other applications, is helpful in combating the pain of arthritis. Lloyd A. Hall found ways to sterilize foods and medical supplies. Ernest E. Just became a leading authority on cell physiology. Lewis T. Wright made advances in critical antibiotic research, and Daniel Hale Williams performed the first open heart surgery. There was, however, one early black scientist whose special importance, aside from his inventive genius, was in the field of political struggle against oppression and for equality. Benjamin Banneker, born 1731, died 1806. In most texts, he is described as the surveyor who laid out the city of Washington, but he was much more than that. Banneker was a scientist, astronomer, mathematician, clockmaker, and surveyor. Earlier, he alluded to Samuel Slater, the Englishman who invented a textile machine and who, when prohibited from bringing his plans for the machine to this country, memorized the blueprints and then reconstructed the machine from memory. Benjamin Banneker was able to lay out the city of Washington after memorizing much more detailed plans to which he had only limited access as an assistant. Originally, a young Frenchman had been given the job of planning and laying out the Capitol. Banneker was one of his three assistants. The young Frenchman got into a dispute with Thomas Jefferson and, as a result, took his plans and left for France, leaving Jefferson in the lurch. Banneker stepped forward and volunteered to do the job on the basis of what he retained in his memory. That's how the city was finally laid out. Banneker made the first clock ever built in the U.S. He built it entirely of wood and carved each gear by hand. The clock kept perfect time, and people from all over the country came to see it. Banneker should also be remembered for the almanac he prepared in 1792 and each year thereafter for 10 years. The Banneker was one of those guys. He was an alien. I don't believe Benjamin Banneker. You know what I'm saying? I know that sounds anti-black because white supremacists say the aliens built the pyramids. Ancient Greeks built the pyramids. They be making up shit. But Banneker was such an alien that I just believe, man. That man he was a Martian for real. Like the stuff that they write about what Banneker did is just incredible. Anyway, what is politically significant in Banneker's history is that he was the only contemporary of Thomas Jefferson to challenge him on the issue of equality. Every school child is taught that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, which contained this famous sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson. P.S. Let's have sex with slave children. Let's find a 12-year-old girl and penetrate her. Yes, that's what I do. Thomas Jefferson." Fuck Thomas Jefferson, that son of a bitch. Go back in time and whop his ass up. Anyway, but Jefferson was also a wealthy slave owner. And even though he sold off all his slaves toward the end of his life, his concept of equality did not extend to black people. He also had written that the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowment both of body and mind. This was no chance statement. The collection of Jefferson's works demonstrate that these sentiments appeared widely in his writings. Even though the 18th century became known in history as the Enlightenment, especially the years following the revolutions in the US and France, Jefferson held to his reactionary, racist view of black people. None of the outstanding leaders at the time directly took Jefferson to task for the flagrant contradiction between the florid language he used in the Declaration of Independence and the ugly practice of slavery, which in fact was validated in the Constitution. It remained for Banneker to use his almanac, not almanac, what the fuck? It remained for Banneker to use his almanac for this purpose. He attached to it an 11-page handwritten letter that systematically took apart Jefferson's lofty proclamation of inalienable rights, while at the same time condoning the vicious practice of slavery. This was one of the few, perhaps the only, direct attacks on Jefferson, the man who, to this day, along with Andrew Jackson, is honored by the Democratic capitalist politicians at their annual Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners as a symbol of democracy and freedom. Banneker's letter to Jefferson did oblige the latter to back off somewhat. In a letter dated August 30th, 1791, Jefferson thanked Banneker. I can add with truth that nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commence for raising the condition both of their black peoples, body and mind, so that it ought to be. I do see such proofs that you exhibit that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of the want of them is owing merely to degraded conditions of their existence both in Africa and in America. Blah, 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 blah. I'm Thomas Jefferson, a big fuck boy, a big fucking retard. Fucking stupid son of a bitch. Fuck Thomas Jefferson, man. Anyway, Jefferson said he was taking the liberty of sending Banneker's almanac to the French Academy of Science because he considered it a document to which our whole color has a right for their justification against the doubts which have been entertained of them. It is only because of Banneker's struggle for equality and against oppression that Jefferson, who held such an eminent position in U.S. history as a liberal, was forced to retreat somewhat from his racist views. By way of acknowledgement, it should be said that Louis Haber, in his book Black Pioneers in Science and Invention, has done as much to popularize what was so little known about the achievements of black scientists as Paul D. Decroux did for biologists more than a half century ago in his lucid exposition, Microbe Hunters. The individual scientist in this modern era of the scientific technological revolution faces a vastly different world than the one in which Banneker or even Thomas Edison at a later date lived and worked. The role of the individual scientist has been diminished by the emergence of capitalist collectivism in the big business laboratory. Today's vast laboratory complexes are organized and controlled by the mighty corporate giants and employ thousands of scientists. The giant corporations compel all scientific personnel to sign contracts that any invention they may develop in the course of their work are the property of the company. Once again, a work for hire. A work for hire. We spoke about this previously in the live stream. You could have a record deal. You write a song, work for hire. No royalties, no masters, no mechanicals, no type of publishing rights. It's a work for hire. I was watching The Wire, unfortunately, because I hate The Wire so far. And I remember that episode, I think it's episode 3 or 4, when the brothers are slinging drugs in the apartment and Michael B. Jordan's character, man, he says, you know, these chicken nuggets, man, whoever invented the chicken nugget is probably a billionaire. And Barksdale says to Michael B. Jordan's character, don't you know that man working for McDonald's isn't paid a single penny off of the chicken McNugget. He was told to go back into the factory after a nice pat on the back from the bosses, who then rake up all that money some more. So yeah, for all the people here who are anti-communist, who are anti-socialist, and you're so pro-capitalist, you know, like I know, we would probably have a cure for cancer if there was no profit motive in continuing to treat people for cancer. You know, like I know, millions of people could still be alive if there was no profit motive for keeping some people sick and uninsured, or forcing them to pay for expensive insurance and premiums. You know, like I know, that the medical system should not be a profit-driven system. Nobody's bank account should determine whether they get medical treatment. But if you are a pro-capitalist person, you essentially are agreeing with the idea that, yeah, maybe a pharmaceutical company can own a patent on a drug. Maybe a pharmaceutical company or a medical research lab can invest more money in Viagra research than AIDS treatment. That's essentially what you're saying. And you people make me sick. I hope you get sick one day and you can't pay for it and you just keel off on the side of the road, like roadkill, you sick bastard, you. Okay? So we have to send, this is the first person to the gulag. We're going to send one person to the gulag here in the horizontal chat. If you're coming into the horizontal chat doing anarchy, you're just a sick bastard, aren't you? You come into the horizontal live stream doing anarchy? No, no, no. That's where the intellectuals lay. That's where the smart people play. And you coming over here to fuck up our day? Oh no, you gotta go. You gotta go to the gulag. Go, be gone. Continuing here. Superimposed on them is a labyrinth of laboratories directly controlled by the Pentagon. The great universities of today are intimate collaborators. The great universities of today are intimate collaborators of the Pentagon, and few have real independence as to how to allocate their scientific investigations. One of the truly important scientific inventions of modern times was the transistor. True to the age in which we live, it was developed in the laboratories of Bell Telephone Company in 1948 by American physicists John Bardeen and Walter H. Brattain. How many hundreds of scientific workers helped lay the basis for it is not really taken into account. When mass layoffs take place, such as we've described with AT&T, what happens to the laid-off scientific personnel? How does it affect the pursuit of their scientific career? In that highly significant layoff, no breakdown was given as to how it affected Black scientific workers, women, or other oppressed people. There's not a word as to whether affirmative action has been a factor in the employment of Black, Latin, Asian, Native, Arab, and women workers, or whether the layoffs took place in accordance with affirmative action guidelines. The third world brain drain. This is something I've been speaking about a lot. The third world brain drain. Very important for us to tackle this topic right here. The scientific technological revolution has had a deleterious effect on third world scientific personnel and the development of science and inventions. Immediately after the Second World War, the U.S. embarked on a vast campaign to pirate both the technology and the scientific personnel of the other imperialist countries. It also started to drain the building development of science and technology in the oppressed countries. With respect to the imperialist countries, it is well known how right after the war, the U.S. brought captured German scientific personnel here to work on rockets and space flights. But it wasn't only from Germany. The British government under Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson finally restricted what was later called the brain drain by an agreement that limited U.S. pirating of scientists, at least from that area. While U.S. government policy has been to restrict immigration and imprison and deport so-called illegal, undocumented workers, it has at the same time enticed third world scientists to the U.S. On the one hand, imperialist policy through a variety of foundations like those endowed by the Fords, Rockefellers, and others seem to be constantly exhorting the oppressed countries to modernize, to become innovative and inventive, and thereby aid their industrial and technological development. But the truth is that every chance they get to entice third world scientists to the U.S., they do so in complete contradiction to the proclaimed policy. They not only extend the stay of visiting students and professors and encourage them to become citizens, but also offer them various monetary inducements. Once again, it is a strategy. It is a strategy for the UK to take the Nigerian doctors, engineers, lawyers, tech personnel, all of those. It's a strategy the same way in the U.S. to take the best of Jamaica, the best of Grenada, the best of Mexico, and hope and bring them to the U.S. and from India as well. It's a strategy to make sure that the global South always, always remains dependent. And also inverse, because the countries they're coming from are bourgeois capitalistic democracies as well, they know that those people who are highly educated are probably going to be demanding more from their country than just more exploitation, more freedom to be exploited in the labor market. So on one hand, Mexico is glad to send their doctors and engineers away because it keeps their population poor, stupid, dispossessed, disorganized, without leadership, of course, and without the intellectuals that have the ability to give voice, to articulate and illustrate the exploitative nature of their system, hopefully so that they can create something better. It's a strategy on both ends because, once again, there are no poor countries in the world. There's no country that's poor. There are only poor people in these countries because they are exploited and their natural resources are exploited. First, by the bourgeois who exist in that country, the rich Chileans, the rich Peruvians, the capital owners of Brazil, and also by the imperialist nations of the North, the Americans, the Europeans by and large, and other great forces in the world. But I digress. So let's continue here. It is one thing to defend the democratic rights of individuals to choose their own domicile. It is another matter if this is part and parcel of a policy of monopoly capitalism to pillage and plunder the resources of third world countries. The scientific personnel of less developed countries are in many respects their most precious resource. The brain drain aspect of the scientific technological revolution has enhanced, not diminished, U.S. imperialism's intense exploitation of the oppressed people. Yeah, this is why I always bring that up, man. And as somebody who has lived in countries where brain drain is a serious problem, my first time living abroad was in Tunisia for extended periods of time. After that, it was Serbia, then Turkey, traveled throughout Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Mauritius, Indonesia, I went there as well. And everywhere I've went, I've heard the story. I've got a cousin in Germany. I have a brother in America. I have an uncle in Canada. Oh, what do? You know, he's an engineer here, but he's a taxi driver over there. That person has a master's degree here, but they're sweeping floors there. And once again, even if they're sweeping floors in Germany instead of working as a doctor in Tunisia, once again, people are motivated by the profit motive in a capitalist system. So sweeping floors in Germany pays way more than being a doctor in, let's say, Kenya or Tunisia or something like that. So this is a tactic. Once again, it is a tactic by the capitalist class and the imperialist and neo-colonialist in the West, as we call it, to make sure the global South remains poor, stupid, ignorant. I would say this is probably the most pernicious, the most evil form of neo-colonialism. We know it's wicked when they're stealing the resources, like the material resources, the oil, the gas, the diamonds, the minerals of Africa. But I think, once again, as a materialist and as a Marxist, all value is derived from people to begin with. And if you're stealing people, once again, this is, I think, probably the most wicked form of neo-colonialism today. Well, let's jump here. Black labor today. Extrapolating from the population figures provided in the 1986 annual report of the National Urban League on the State of Black America, there are about 28 million Black people in the United States. That's larger than most African countries and larger than most middle-sized countries represented in the United Nations. By always referring to Black people as a minority, the bourgeois press obscures the class significance of the Black population, which is overwhelmingly working class and which therefore, especially when taken together with Latin America, Asia, and Native population, adds a very significant dimension to the whole character of the working class here. To regard the Black struggle strictly from the viewpoint of minority-majority is to lose much of its profound social and political implications. What should interest working class students of the black struggle, however, is that even these figures, which are probably understated, disclose a social viability which has strong revolutionary potentialities given the conditions we believe are developing that will give a fundamentally altered social composition to the working class. To understand the current state of the to understand the current state of black labor in the United States, it is necessary to first look at the mass migration of black people to the North, which took on momentum early in the 20th century and reached considerable proportions at the end of the First World War. Mass production industries in the US, like auto, especially Ford, and steel, were in a period of high capitalist development. When this culminated in the First World War, it opened the gates of some industries and fields of economic endeavor to black labor, notwithstanding rank discrimination and entrenched racial barriers. These were not relaxed. Instead, artificial classifications were created so that black workers doing almost exactly the same work as whites got far lower wages. Nor were barriers lifted in the skilled trades and AFL craft unions. These were as rigidly racist in their approach as they had been before the First World War. But black labor continually found ways to gain skills and get skilled jobs despite government, employer, and union racial discrimination. I think some black laborers were, I feel like some of this is written in the framing of like that, post-civil rights, lift yourself up by the bootstraps. This guy is obviously a Marxist, how he's writing it, but I'm getting this impression that, there's always this hint of like black exceptionalism to everything he's writing. Because, the vast majority of black folks, they went up into the North and, they were ghettoized. They didn't find the good jobs. They were still, sweeping houses and doing menial labor, locked out of the unions, et cetera, et cetera. Some were able to find loopholes in the game. Some were able to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, as we might say. But I don't think we should frame it like, black labor found ways to gain skills and get skilled jobs despite racism. Some black people did, you know what I mean? But let's continue here. It should always be borne in mind that even the first boatloads of slaves who arrived in this country from Africa brought with them useful skills, which were developed even in slave times. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, before the mass migrations from Europe started, there were a considerable number of black workers in industry who had developed skills. But as more and more white labor from Europe became available, black workers began to be relentlessly driven out of industry. These mass migrations from Europe undermined whatever leverage the black workers might have had in industry, notwithstanding discrimination. Things got more and more difficult for them. Capitalism, as the involuntary promoter of the development of the working class, also caused the mass migration of black agricultural workers from the South to the North, notwithstanding the racial barrier or the unemployment as a consequence of the capitalist economic system. More and more black workers got into northern industry, even as the pool of black unemployed grew. That most of these central cities of the North, and now some in the South, have a majority or a very large minority of black people is objectively due to the transformation of capitalist industry with the First and Second World Wars. World War II, in particular, was a much longer war for the U.S. and entailed the construction of many defense facilities. In fact, the entire U.S. industrial apparatus was converted for war purposes, and for the first time, full employment became an artificial phenomenon dependent on war spending. These two objective factors, the First and Second World Wars, also found an echo beginning in 1950 with the Korean War. In the early 1950s, and again during the Vietnam War, employment was artificially propped up by a continuing growth of the defense industries. If today in cities like Detroit, Chicago, Newark, Philadelphia, New York, Atlanta, Memphis, and Birmingham, there are large black populations with some political power, it is not due to any attempt by the ruling class to ameliorate the condition of black workers or to lighten the burden of discrimination. Rather, it comes as a result of objective development arising out of the organic functioning of the capitalist system and the inevitability of imperialist wars and military interventions abroad. This is not to say that the whole industrial structure of the U.S. is due entirely to imperialist wars, but without them, it is difficult to conceive how there could have been such a rapid social transformation in the condition of black and also white workers. The mass migration from the South and back to the South, especially during times of unemployment, is among the objective factors affecting the development of black labor. The subjective factors arise from the freedom struggle, especially the struggles of the 1960s. Very interesting, he's making the argument that, black power or black political and economic and social advancement has been genuinely tied to the project of American empire. I guess we can be kind of lucky that, we saw that advancement after we fought our one good war, World War II. But when you think about it today, right, the majority of those good black jobs, middle-class jobs, are from the federal government. You know what I mean? We over-index in government jobs, particularly in the Fed, right? I think in the DMV is where you find the richest black folks in the country. And all of those are, military people, government contractors, or people directly employed by the state, which was why it was so harmful for, the black American economy when Trump started doging everybody. Like, there's black women and black men out here who lost good pension paying jobs and good union jobs because of Trump's Doge mess and stuff like that. But we do have to grapple with the fact that, black American prosperity has been tied to the imperial project. And so we have to be accountable for that. We have to take, responsibility for that. And there has to be some reckoning with that while we are demanding reparations from the United States government for the centuries of harm the U.S. government has wreaked upon black people. We have to also take into account that we had a very firm and strong hand in maintaining American imperial hegemony. There has been a foundational black Americans like to say we fought in every war. Should we be proud of that? And also, what is the consequence of that? We terrorized the people of Korea. We terrorized the people of Vietnam. We dropped bombs on children in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're terrorizing the people of Iran now. And there's black hands pulling the triggers and pressing the buttons. So there has to be some accountability of that as well. I think this is a very, very, very deep question. It's very perplexing to me. I don't know exactly what to say, okay? I don't know exactly what to say about this. But it's very important to me. I find this question to be very perplexing. But then again, I think we also have to recognize that black folks are not a state. It's not like we're like, we don't have the nation state yet to face responsibility that way. But I do think there has to be a decoupling in the mind. This is why we're doing the series, Foundational Black Americans for Socialism and Reparations. Because we have to decouple this American nationalism, American exceptionalism, this flag-waving FBA movement, and we have to replace it with one that's tied to our black radical tradition, tied to internationalism, tied to a fight for creating a better world, a more just world, a better economic system, along with our fight for a reparations claim. I think these are vitally important, and that's why we're doing this series like this, okay? So, continuing here, the Black freedom struggle. It is utterly impossible to understand the contemporary role of black workers in this country, and particularly their situation in the trade union movement, without considering them in a broader political framework. A study of black labor, especially over the last 25 years, that omitted the general political struggle, the freedom struggle of the black people as a whole, would make for a very constricted and even distorted view of both the great achievements of black workers in the trade union movement and the equally great, if not greater, drawbacks of their situation. Racism has permeated every layer of capitalist society. The trade union movement, from its earliest times up to the present, has been permeated with chauvinism and vicious discriminatory practices. I just finished watching an episode of The Sopranos where there are these black workers who are demanding to get into the union, to have these good union jobs. And, it's an Italian contracting company that just hired all WAPs and all Dagos. And then the Italians called Tony Soprano and crew to come and beat up the black folks with pipes and sticks and baseball bats. It was one of the illest episodes. I'm not going to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but go check out that episode. I'm really enjoying watching The Sopranos right now, and I really want to read a book in relation to the mob's activities with unions. If you know of a book that talks about the history of the mafia and the unions and their collaboration, or how the mafia infested the unions, let me know. Because I have a theory. That the government turned a blind eye to the mob infesting the unions because they wanted to weaken the workers' movement. The capitalist class will do anything to make sure that the workers are disorganized, ununionized, poor, stupid, and ignorant. So, I think that's my theory here, but I want to do more research about that. So if you know of a good book about the mafia and the unions and their history between them two, let me know, because that's a topic I'm very, very, very interested in, okay? And I also think there hasn't been a lot of conversation about socialism and crime. We want to overthrow the capitalist system, but we also know that a criminal element will exist. And I know crime is just essentially when you create restrictions on people's activity. So anything could be crime. Anything could be a crime. You could pass a law tomorrow that says blinking twice is a crime, and therefore everybody's a criminal, right? But I'm talking about people that will seek to undermine the mores and rules of society for their own personal benefit, or to transgress against others. And I think some more reading or scholarship done on communism and crime or socialism and crime will be very interesting as well. So I'm very interested in those two intersections now, but that's because I'm in a weird mood. I'm in a Marxist mafia mood, if that makes sense. Tony Soprano with the Marx beard. You know what I'm saying? That's my mood right now. But I digress. Let's continue. So racism has permeated every layer of capitalist society. The trade union movement, from its earliest times up to the present, has been permeated with chauvinism and vicious discriminatory practices. The trade unions are the most formidable working class organizations in the country. Aside from temporary retreats and taking into account the long duration of the political reaction, they are bound to become organs of the great struggle for emancipation from both racist oppression and capitalist class exploitation. Okay? Shout out to Revolution joining the live stream. Salute to you joining in. I would like to ask you, Revolution, the question: what do you think about the mafia infesting the unions? Do you think that might have been done on purpose? Or do you think it was just a coincidence that the trade union movement in America coincided with the rise of organized crime, particularly the mafia as we understand it, La Cosa Nostra? Do you think it was done on purpose? What do you think? We're just shooting the shit. Just throwing darts on the wall. What you think about that? Anyway, but all of this has to be considered in the broader arena of the overall political struggle of black people, in which the trade unions have certainly been a significant part, but only a part. In reality, what happens there is a reflection of what is going on in the black struggle as a whole. The great battles of the 1960s and 70s in particular must be considered in evaluating and analyzing how this reflected itself in the unions. Just to make one example out of many, in April 1969, some 500 black workers shut down production at the Ford plant in Mahwah, New Jersey, for several days. The workers walked out because a foreman called one of the workers a black bastard. Although the official UAW leadership urged the workers to return to their jobs, they nevertheless stayed out until the foreman was ousted from the plant. This was the famous so-called Wildcat Strike at Mahwah, organized by the United Black Brothers, and it represented a significant victory for all the workers, as we all should be. as we all should be. Shout out to Revolution. He said it was done on purpose. I wouldn't be surprised. We know that the U.S. government worked with gangsters. Didn't they have Lucky Luciano try to ship weapons into southern Italy? Like, there's some story about Lucky Luciano was doing like lifetime in jail, but Luciano had the connections in Sicily when the American government wanted to do a land invasion in Sicily, but they couldn't get like weapons or a landing strip there built or something like that. So they made a deal with Lucky Luciano, who was doing life in jail. Hey, help us get these weapons to Sicily so that we can fight against the fascists, which we kind of like, but we have to fight them now because that's the side we're on, you know. But and Lucky Luciano said, bet. And he called up his mafia connects in Sicily, made it happen for the U.S. Lucky Luciano gets out of jail, and he ends up going to Sicily and living out the rest of his days as a free man, even though he committed mad crimes in America. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. government worked with the mob to undermine the trade union movement explicitly, to undermine any sort of worker unity or larger workers' revolution. So that's a very good point, Revolution. But yeah, let's continue here. So if this significant victory for the UAW at that period is seen only in the trade union framework, it could present an oddity. But when seen in the larger framework of the overall black political struggle, one gets a far truer measure of its significance for the local struggle as well as nationally. There were other significant developments in the UAW that came on the heels of the great 1967 rebellion in Detroit and ushered in a series of electoral victories for the black workers in the UAW. Suddenly, the UAW leadership stopped the practice of mobilizing opposition to black candidates in local elections. Within a few months after the formation of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers were elected as presidents of Local 900, Ford's Wayne plant, Local 47, Chrysler's Detroit Forge, Local 961, Chrysler's Eldron Gear, Local 7, Chrysler, Local 51, Plymouth, and even Local 1248, Chrysler Mopar, where only 20% of the plant's 989 workers were black. A black was elected for the first time as vice president of Briggs Local 21. That's dope. Sounds like the DSA today. A minority of the members are black, but the faces of the most powerful people getting into power are, of color, right? So, shout out to Revolution. He said, America placed the puppet Batista in Cuba, and the Italian Jewish mafia was in Cuba. America had no issue with that. Fidel forced them out. Vegas came about due to that. That's another very good point. Yes, Cuba was a mafia state that America was just glad to have. They were glad to allow the mafia to go there to do business and, do rum running and bootlegging and all sorts of shit. Yeah, they were happy to do that. They were happy to turn Cuba into Epstein Island, with all sorts of wicked shit going down there. And thank God Fidel came there and cleaned that bitch up. God bless Fidel. God bless Che Guevara, and Viva la Revolucion in Cuba, for real. I pray every single day for the Cuban people, man, because I can't imagine what it would be like for the whole world to turn their back on you while the most powerful country in the world tries to starve you out. We have a lot to say about, Gaza. Gaza was 2 million people under siege before October 6th. Cuba is about 10 million people under siege with nobody there to help them. And I think this is a divide and conquer tactic by the imperialist powers now. They're being so wicked to the Palestinians that we almost forget about Cuba. We almost forget about Venezuela. We almost forget about the people of Sudan and how, the capitalist class and the imperialists, the neo-colonialists are just running rampant and just allowing these people to be slaughtered. You know what I mean? For profit. That's a very good point right there, Revolution. You a smart man. You a smart man, my guy. Anyway, so Revolution says, yes, Hermano, I appreciate your respect to my people. My people are your people. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. I got love for Cuba for real. Number one, because Cuba held Asada. I will never say anything negative about Cuba because y'all held Asada down. Y'all held Huey P. Newton down. Cuba sent mad doctors around the world. I don't know if you're from Cuba or not. I don't care. But, I think Cuba is a shining example of what a country should be like. And I'm not saying Cuba doesn't have its problems, but goddamn, when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to standing up for black revolutionaries, there is no country in the world that will always have my love and respect than Cuba. Shit, I might have a son or a daughter and name them Cuba. That's how much I love that country, for real, for what they did for our heroes, for our freedom fighters. You get what I'm saying? And they're facing down the devil incarnate. Cuba's facing down the devil incarnate, the U.S. government, the most powerful country in the world, nuclear bombs, mad military bases, and it's a small country, with 10 million people, with no money, being starved out right now, and yet and still they hold their head up high. I'll always have love for Cuba, for holding down Asada and our revolutionary heroes, for real. Okay? But anyway, so before the Manawa struggle took place, there were a considerable number of political rebellions and insurrections of black people. There was the Harlem Rebellion, followed by Watts, Newark, and Cleveland, to name only a few. And of course, the largest of the mass insurrections took place in Detroit. Following the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, there were a total of more than 500 rebellions throughout the whole country. How then can the struggle of black workers for equality be seen as strictly trade union struggles? Few, if any, of the very significant gains made by black workers could have been attained without the so-called outside struggle. That is, the general political struggle put up by black people. That was the real catalyst, the basic generator for the that was the real catalyst, the basic generator for the trade union gains, many of which were not only vital but indispensable, considering the long and difficult task to attain equality, which still goes on. What is said about the black struggle applies equally and to some extent even more to the Latin struggle, the women's struggle, and the gay and lesbian struggle. Any gains made in the unions must be related to the broader struggles which generated them. It would, of course, be fruitful to speculate on how different it could have been had the struggles been initiated by the trade union movement rather than being forced upon it. But this is the music of the future, not of the past. There are about 110 million workers in the U.S. today. In the mid-1980s, only about 17.3 million belonged to unions, as we've discussed earlier. However, there can be no doubt that the union movement will become the fundamental lever for working class struggle. The anti-labor offensive, which has been sweeping the country for several years, is bound to produce one of the truly great upsurges of the working class. And this time, the union movement will not be in the rear guard, but in the vanguard of the struggle as regards Black, Latino, Asian, and Native people, women and lesbians, and gay men. The tardiness of the working class response to the offensive of the ruling class in the face of such profound political and social reaction can be explained in part by the lack of a mass political party of the working class. The response from the working class, both organized and unorganized, is likely to come as the result of spontaneous outbreaks, which will take the form of trade unionism, but not necessarily in the way the trade union officialdom presides over the union movement. What more concrete form it will take, we have to leave for events themselves to reveal. I do believe that it's beneficial for us to be a part of unions, but we shouldn't just resort to trade unionism, which is just the idea that the workers come together and fight for marginal better benefits, better pay, less working hours, more free vacation days, paid vacation days, whatever. The idea is for the working class to ultimately seize the means of production. The idea is for that trade union to transform into the workers' cooperative, overseeing the means of production being produced into other commodities and things like that. So I think we should also keep this in mind that the trade union isn't just an end in itself. It's a tool for the ultimate liberation of the working class, for the working class to seize the power of the state. That is what we are looking at here. So very important, very important. So suffice it to say that the very intensity of the political reaction generated by the Reagan administration and prepared earlier by the Carter administration and its predecessors has created the conditions for a tumultuous social upheaval, not a controlled one, that could be easily manipulated by contemporary bourgeois politicians and the trade union bureaucracy. The very tardiness in preparing a party of the working class, which in Europe and other areas has taken generations to build up, makes inevitable that the pent-up rage at the oppression and exploitation endured by all the strata of the working class will break out in another form. It would seem to emanate most easily from the workplace and from the vast pool of unemployed. The special oppression of women, Black, Latin, Asian, Arab, and Native workers will make them a magnet for one another. A former science advisor to Reagan in late 1985 told a cable news network, CNN interviewer, that the unemployment in Western Europe constitutes the greatest danger to Western civilization. Of course it's true, but not only in Europe. The capitalist recovery here in the US has been taking place amidst some 15 million unemployed. If comprehensive calculations are made, social peace cannot be maintained on such an explosive material basis. Interesting, very interesting. The impact of high tech on Black postal workers. In attempting to evaluate the impact of the scientific technological revolution on Black workers, as well as other oppressed people, it is best to avoid focusing our analysis on a narrow sector of industry. Also, while the influence of high tech has been most profound in industries such as auto, electrical, and steel, we have already dealt with these areas in some measure. We are also deliberately avoiding areas where racist or sexist discrimination is most pronounced, or where Black, Latin, and women workers still constitute only a very small portion of the workforce. A broad sector of the economy where there are a significant number of Black, Latin, and women workers is more appropriate for this study. By taking a sector of the economy where so-called optimum conditions prevail, where racist and sexist oppression is generally regarded as less significant than in other areas, we are better able to illustrate our theme, namely that high-tech results in low-wage jobs and unemployment in all sectors of the economy. This explains why we have chosen what seems like an unlikely area, the U.S. Postal Service, for this study. Furthermore, it is probably the oldest service industry in the country, being created around the time of the U.S. Constitution in 1789. Though racism may be a less significant factor in the Postal Service than in some other areas, nevertheless, this is the current situation for Black postal workers. Blacks appear to be concentrated in less future-oriented Postal Service jobs. When racial concentration versus dispersal of employees in the Postal Service is analyzed, Blacks appear to be concentrated in the lower range and low-paying jobs, levels 1 through 6. In contrast, in grade levels 7 through 38, 90% of the postal employees are non-minority. Thus, the mode of substitution in this case is by a targeted racial distribution in which Blacks are concentrated in the jobs most likely to be affected by technology, particularly the 9-digit zip code, automated mail processing, and flat sorting technology and the electronic message system. The same is true for Latin and other oppressed people. During the depths of the Great Depression, work at the post office was considered the best and most secure job for anybody from a working class family. Even today, assuming there are openings, it probably offers more job security for a young person from a working class family than other areas. However, a great transformation is underway here too, although it is not publicly recognized. I'll never forget when my mama said I should be a mailman. It's a good job, honey. You get benefits. It's a good government job. Hold it down. How different my life would be if I took my mama up on that. Oh yeah, I'll be a mailman, mom. Getting chased by dogs and shit. Fucking niggas' wives while they away at work. Shit would have been crazy. In 1970, during the Nixon administration, Congress enacted the Postal Reorganization Act, or PRA, With this new law, the government took decisive steps that were to have far-reaching significance for many millions of workers. For the postal workers, it began a chain of developments concerning the dispatching, processing, and delivery of mail, which ultimately resulted in a loss of almost 100,000 jobs as of 1983. That's crazy. All right. Cowboy Christian says, be a kingpin. Nah, I wouldn't want to do that. The PRA was the first early warning of what has become a virtual daily phenomenon, the so-called deregulation of industry, whose principal aim and function, despite claims of modernization by the ruling class, is to ditch restraining and protective labor legislation and to get into private hands anything they feel can be profitable. The PRA made a so-called independent agency of the Postal Service, which had been regarded as a full-fledged arm of the government with representation in the cabinet since way back in 1828. The act reduced the status of the post office and turned it into an agency of the executive branch with an 11-person board of governors, 9 of them appointed by the president with the approval of the Senate, and a postmaster general who is responsible to the president. Now, I know some people would say, well, the post office needed to modernize. It didn't need to be a whole wing of the government. You know, we have phones. The internet was right around the corner in the 1980s when the PRA passed. You get what I'm saying? So things changed, right? I understand that things changed. But I look at this as a broader part of, once again, neoliberalism and capitalism, the idea that everything can be for profit, everything can be sectioned off, whole branches of the government can be sold off and privatized and things like that. And the profit motive is above all. The profit motive is above the government. The profit motive is above actual, service to the people. I know this is very boring. That's why y'all are dropping out right now, because we're talking about the fucking post office. I understand. Just hearing about the post office might be boring, but I'm a nerd, so I'm enjoying all of this. I'm nerding out. I didn't know about any of this, but it explains so much. It might put you to sleep hearing about the post office and how it was sort of sold off to the highest bidder and essentially became, a for-profit industry that eventually the government wants to see be unprofitable so that they can privatize the postal service too. I think this is indicative of the wickedness and sickness within capitalism. So while y'all might find this to be a snooze fest, I understand. This is actually really fucking interesting for me. I'm nerding out right here. Anyway, let's continue here. So the whole idea was to gradually shrink the vast and complex network of postal services, introduce a series of technological innovations, and put it on a so-called business basis. The income and outgo of funds were to be equalized, and eventually a net surplus was to be produced in the same way as in private industry. What has really happened since the PRA went into effect? Despite the decline in the number of postal workers from 756,000 in 1970 to 660,000 in 1983, the Postal Service has increased its piece volume by more than 20 billion. In 1981 alone, mail volume reached a record 110 billion pieces. I don't tell veterans, thank you for your service. If you went to go kill Iraqi children or Afghan children, I tell you, you're a bastard and you should reform and then join our side. But yeah, you're a bastard piece of shit. I say thank you for your service to postal workers. Postal workers are better than our veterans. Postal workers deserve all the praise that we give the baby killers who went to Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, in Iran right now, killing babies in schools and shit like that. Killing children in Gaza. Yeah, fuck our soldiers, our veterans. Fuck that. Salute a postal worker when you see him and give a bird to a veteran, and then give them a flyer telling them to come to the Socialist Reading Club. But yeah, our veterans. No. Our postal workers. Yeah. Anyway, despite this growth in productivity, however, in the last contract announced on December 24th, 1984, the government, through an arbitration panel, imposed the notorious two-tier wage pattern on the American Postal Workers Union and the National Association of Letter Carriers. This meant a 25% wage cut for the workers hired after a certain date. In time, this lower wage may apply to all workers unless a combined effort of all the unions, not only the postal unions, is mobilized against it throughout the country. So in time, this lower wage may apply to all workers unless a combined effort of all the unions, not only the postal unions, is mobilized against it throughout the country. The two-tier system of wage levels first got a foothold in none other than the Boeing Company, one of the pillars of high technology in the aerospace industry. At the same time, notwithstanding the government's bold talk about private enterprise standing on its own feet, it has continued a long line of luscious contracts to the big corporations, which supply the materials to the Postal Service. In addition, the government is trying to weaken the no layoff clause in the postal workers' contract. The unions have a real job on their hands whenever they have to face the government in a high-tech negotiation, particularly with the restrictions on their right to strike and after what the Reagan administration did with its vicious union busting against the air traffic controllers, PATCO. The new relationship of the government, particularly Congress, to the postal workers can be seen in the drastic decline in postal appropriations and share of operating expenses over the fiscal years 1971 through 1983. A reactionary Congress and a reactionary White House have combined through the Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan years to steadily cut down the amount of appropriations for the first post office. Cut down the amount of appropriations for the post office and let the broad public carry the weight of financing postal operations. Of course, in those years, all other vital services by federal and state governments were also cut down. But what is necessary to distinguish here is that the entire strategy has been geared toward investment in the mechanization of the dispatching, processing, and delivery of postal services. A significant portion of the appropriations has been devoted to the automation of mail processing, the installation of optical character readers and barcode sorters in major post offices. All this is bound to squeeze out more workers. The aim of this automation is to save nearly $1 billion a year in labor costs. The aim of this automation is to save nearly $1 billion a year in labor costs, which means that the jobs of many more workers, especially Black, Latin, and women workers, are at peril. An official history published by the Postal Service itself says that after the introduction of ZIP plus 4 in 1983, the first delivery phase of the new OCR, optical character readers, channel sorters, and BCS barcode sorters, was completed by mid-1984. When fully implemented and used with the expanded ZIP plus 4 codes, the automated system will save an estimated $960 million annually in labor costs alone. What happened to the electronic mail delivery service is instructive for seeing how the big corporations allow new technologies to be developed at government expense only to take them over themselves. The U.S. government first developed electronic computer originated mail, or ECOM, which went into service in 1982. It allowed large volume mailers to transmit messages via computer to selected post offices, where they were printed out, placed in envelopes, and delivered by letter carriers. But then a group of large private multinational companies, including UPS, Federal Express, and Western Union, instigated the antitrust division of the Justice Department to file a suit charging the Postal Service with unfair competition because of the low rates charged. Although the Post Office won, the so-called Independent Post Rate Commission then demanded that ECOM rates be doubled, which finally forced the government to abandon that part of the delivery of electronic mail which pertains to domestic use. However, the government continues to maintain the service called Intel Post, which is an electronically transmitted international service. Very interesting. So the government invented email so large companies didn't have to waste everybody's time delivering mail back and forth to each other. But then the private companies were mad that the Postal Service was beating them in price, because capitalism only works when major corporations are able to fix a price through their monopoly. And if they actually have somebody coming in with a lower price, that's not how capitalism is supposed to work. All the capitalists give this argument, with more competition, this is better for consumers because they have different choices and different prices. But the major corporations, they say, we don't want competition. We just want to control shit, essentially. So yeah, essentially, these companies try to take the U.S. government to court because the U.S. government could charge almost nothing, and that's not fair for them. So even though the government won, unsurprisingly, they then got rid of their e-com service, which was like email. And we could have all had free email. Now, technically, how things worked out, we kind of have free email, but we all know Google is like reading our emails. We all know, Yahoo is reading our emails and they're selling our data back and forth. So we really don't have free shit, but imagine if we lived in a world where everybody had a free email account or e-com account, and your data was not being sold to major corporations back and forth. Very interesting. Alternative history is always something to think about right there. All right, so we're almost done with this text. We only have 2 more pages, and then we're going to wrap it up. If you have any comments or questions for me, put it in the chat, and we will try to get to it before we get out of here. Only 2 more pages, and then that's a wrap for today. So the struggle by the big carriers to dismantle the Postal Service was foreshadowed by a big business-inspired article in the June 1979 Forbes magazine entitled, "Do We Really Need the Postal Service?" Here it is necessary to demonstrate the close links that now exist between the Postal Service and the entire telecommunications industry. Real competition from any number of services in private industry operates as a goad to the Postal Service management to follow suit with each and every new mechanical innovation showing promise of reducing costs and hence the unit cost of labor. Essentially, that is what really lies behind all cost-reducing programs. In the period of the late 1960s and early 70s, when the PRA was passed, carried out one of its devastating assaults on the mass of telephone operators, which took a huge toll on Black, Latin, and women workers especially. What happened at AT&T has exceptional relevance to the situation of the postal workers. Even at that time, it had become clear that the telecommunications industry had tremendous influence in the government, and that the enactment of the PRA will begin active competition between private industry and the Postal Service, in the process liquidating many thousands upon thousands of jobs. However, the postal workers saw the Postal Reorganization Act in an entirely different context. They had just gone through their first and most important strike, which, despite some concessions, had won legitimacy of their union. This was accomplished even though Nixon sent the U.S. Army into the post offices of the great metropolitan areas of the country in an effort to intimidate and break the workers' resistance. That the postal workers were able to survive this and grow in strength explains why they won subsequent gains and concessions from the government. In all this, the historical background of the U.S. Postal Service should not be forgotten. Like other institutions of U.S. capitalism, it has been profoundly segregationist since the beginning. It was not until 1865, the last year of the Civil War, that the laws prohibiting Black people from carrying mail bags from stagecoach to post office were abolished. Racism has continued during the many decades thereafter, partly as a result of outright discrimination by white organized unions. Racism has continued during the many decades thereafter, partly as a result of outright discrimination by white organized unions. The founding of the National Alliance of Postal Workers in 1913 marked a milestone in self-help organizational mediums by Black workers when the leadership of white organized unions would not open their doors to Black workers. It was not until the 1940s that Black, Latin, and women workers were more freely admitted to the unions under the impact of many profound social changes, most important of which was the civil rights struggle and the upsurge of the labor movement as a whole. This finally made it possible for Black, Latin, and women workers to take advantage of employment opportunities in the Postal Service. Even now, despite attrition and pending future layoffs, minorities since 1978 have steadily increased as a proportion of total Postal Service employment. Thus, in the fiscal year 1981, a year of big layoffs as a result of the capitalist recession all over industry, the Postal Service hired 10,064 blacks, 2,765 Hispanics, and 2,289 other minorities for a total of 15,118, or 27.6% of new employees. Of course, with anticipated future employment reductions, the picture is not encouraging, particularly if one takes into account the direction the government is taking in pushing the replacement of workers with sophisticated technology. It is more and more geared to the telecommunication industry, of which the government is the principal supporter and promoter. However, the future of women is a different matter. Female postal employment is predicted to rise, while the proportion of black workers as a whole is expected to remain constant. The dispatch and delivery of mail are a component of the transportation and communication industry. Like railroad workers, truck drivers, and waterfront workers, postal workers participate in the freight handling process. Transportation facilitates the circulation of capitalist commodities, and the scientific technological revolution has accelerated this process. What automation has done in the Postal Service is another form of what containerization did in the shipping and maritime industries. The postal worker must view themselves as part of the communications, telecommunications, and transportation industries with whom they have so much in common. The employers and the capitalist state have a sustained and abiding interest in artificially keeping the workers in these industries apart and separated. They do this all the more to divide black and white. However, the scientific technological revolution has forged a new link between a variety of industries which hitherto seemed to be very separated. It has opened up a new vista, a new horizon which lays out and broadens the basis of working class solidarity. The capitalist system in its early stages needed a government postal service in order to develop capitalist industry and communications as a whole. It could not have developed the productive forces without almost 2 centuries of a government-sponsored postal service. Now, with the development of telecommunications, the government wants to ditch that part of the service which is no longer lucrative for business and high finance, and retain that portion which still facilitates big business, while holding a club over the heads of the postal workers through compulsory no-strike mediation and arbitration. Once again, the parallels of slavery. We started reading about how slavery sort of laid the bedrock for capitalism, and while slavery is incompatible with the capitalist system, essentially the capitalist mode of production wants to retain some aspects of slavery. They still want workers to be sort of at the mercy of their capitalist overlords. And so it's very full circle right here. The Postal Service was an essential part of building the bourgeois capitalist state, being able to transmit information, technology, and communication across vast distances for cheap and free. But now, as capitalism has developed and it has become more dynamic and more productive, what do they need? Only the base route of this mode of transportation and communication facilitation, while other parts of it can be stripped and more profit can be made from basically dismantling the Postal Service as it originally was. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay? All right. So, Robust Uncut said, what's an FBA? It's a Foundational Black American. Foundational Black American. That is an FBA. All right, final paragraph right here. If you have any comments or questions for me, put it in the chat. We'll read it before we shut off the live stream. Final paragraph right here. Union leaders must make particularly clear that there is absolutely no valid reason why the capitalist government should be able to dictate the wages and working conditions of the postal workers and at the same time deprive the workers of their right to strike. The Postal Service is but one segment of the telecommunications industry, as are RCA, GE, or AT&T. It is really one connected industry, and the demand should be made to remove the anti-strike clause against the postal workers. And that's the end of that text. That was the longest text in that book. That was a whole academic paper. Which was very profound. I wanted to read, more today, but that was quite a lot to chew on. And we've been on live for about 2 hours or so. So we're about to cut it short right here. But let's close out the polls in the horizontal live stream. And first in the horizontal live stream, let me give a shout out to Wasaru, 20th Century, my guy Kamal, and Robust Uncut. Yeah, shout out to them. Let me close out the poll. Let's see what the poll says. All right. What is the strongest weapon for black working class liberation? Unsure, but fuck Trump and MAGA got 49% of the votes. Socialist Revolution got 25% of the votes. Black worker organizing, 13% of the votes. Multiracial class solidarity got 13% of the votes. I like those results, though, revolution or black workers organizing is, still, I think, higher up on the scale. Let's go to the vertical live stream and see what people said in the vertical live stream. Right here. Okay. In the vertical live stream. All right, let's go here. Looks like we got a lot of white supremacists that jumped in here. All right, does capitalism depend on racial inequality to survive? No, they're separate, got 43% of the votes. Yes, it's built into it, 37% of the votes. Unsure, but fuck Trump and MAGA, got 14% of the votes. Often, but not always, got 6% of the votes. All right, so this is obviously the white supremacists had their way with that. The fascists and trolls, by and large, had their way with that. But most of the time we do the polls, the correct answer tends to win. This is just an aberration, I would say. But we're going to make sure some of these people never return. They're going to the gulag. But I'm going to clean up the chat after this. But yeah, this has been a good live stream. Thank you for showing up, like always, to all of you. Shout out to everybody that joined in the vertical live stream. If I read your comment, you got a shout out, essentially. Y'all be easy out there. All power to the people. All power to the people. All power to the people. And peace.